Hello. Hi.
Summer of '92. Scott was 24 when we first met in November 1991, after he expressed interest in joining my monthly abductee support group. He was seeing a psychotherapist at the time because of anxieties related to his abduction experiences, and she thought the group could be helpful in giving him the opportunity to meet other abduction experiencers and in allowing him to share the conflicts that had grown out of his encounters. My policy then and now has been to meet personally with abductees before including them in the group. Scott's case demonstrates the dramatic personal transformations that are possible when an abductee directly confronts the reality of his abduction experiences and the powerful emotions associated with them. Scott also is one of an enlarging group of abductees who discover an apparent dual human-alien identity in the course of their exploratory work. Scott is a tall, husky, forthright young man whose slightly breezy manner belies his underlying thoughtfulness and sensitivity, qualities which have expanded in the time that I have known him. Although Scott has resisted formal education, he reflects a strong, untutored intelligence. Scott works as an actor and filmmaker and with his father in his auto mechanic business, and is a talented builder, capable of repairing pianos as well as cars. He has played the piano since childhood and is an aspiring songwriter. He also wanted to be a pilot, but all the medical stuff he was put through as a result of his abduction experiences made this difficult. I've always kept busy, Scott says, to keep my mind off what's been happening to me. In the summer of 1992, Scott went through a period in which his customary vigilant, animalistic, and fear-laden defensiveness, calling himself a security freak and fearing each night that he would be abducted, Scott hardwired the house where he lives alone with a radio alarm he activated at night, mounted surveillance cameras in several locations as a deterrent, and a microphone by the front door with a speaker next to his bed for night monitoring, gave way for a time to more intense feelings of vulnerability, helplessness, and separateness from his family. I felt completely open to anybody to strike me down or do whatever they wanted to. Instead of the controlled person he had been, Scott discovered that the uncontrolled person was the real thing. I was scared, he said. I felt I could be destroyed. I did not feel safe at all. It was completely unpaved ground for me. It was this opening, the surrender of control, that paved the way to the transformation of Scott's relationship to his abduction experiences and to profound changes in his experience of his own consciousness and identity. Scott's sister, Lee, 19 months younger than he, is also an abductee, although she has been slower to recover the material related to her experiences. For many years she clung to the possibility that her fears of sexual intimacy were related to abuse by her father or someone else. A careful history failed to substantiate a story of abuse that could account for her fears, while a powerful hypnosis session that we did in November 1992 revealed a disturbing, invasive early teenage experience in which she described being taken aboard a UFO by alien beings. A probing instrument was inserted in her vagina, and some sort of tissue, perhaps an egg, was removed. 10 days later, Lee embarked on a previously planned trip to India for several months to pursue her spiritual development, especially to study Tibetan Buddhism. After reading my account of her brother's case, which their mother had sent to her in India, Lee was concerned that my brief summary of her experiences would make her appear as too much of a victim. I do wish to help by having my story known, to inform people. She would like to see a more well-rounded account to portray a series of encounters which not only produced physical and sexual trauma, but provided a priceless opportunity for spiritual growth and sensitivity to all sentient beings, ranging from insects to those of other dimensions and planetary systems. This adjustment, she continued, would make me feel less an intergalactic rape victim and more like what I view it as of yet, an experience of something which has nearly blown my head off with expansion of consciousness. I am strangely grateful." Earlier on in the letter, Lee had written, "Tibetan Buddhism as a philosophy recognizes much of the spiritual encounters and awarenesses abductees have had." Scott and Lee's mother, Emily, age 48, works in real estate and supports her husband Henry's business. She may also be an abductee, but what is most remarkable about Emily, and is an important aspect of this case, is the extraordinary steadfastness and support that she has given to her children. She is the only parent who comes regularly to my support group meetings, and though she has suffered deeply over her children's abduction-related distresses, Emily has fully accepted the reality of what her children report they have been through. In addition, she feels a deep intuitive sense that the process they are undergoing is one of personal growth and ultimate enlightenment. This attitude, whatever its ultimate truth may prove to be, is unique in my experience among the parents of abductees. Scott's father, Henry, has been a mechanic for 20 years and has recently started another business. Henry is cautious about talking of his feelings and views, but is also supportive of his children. He believes what they have reported, but has more of a show-me attitude toward UFOs and aliens. Scott has a brother, Robert, who has reported no involvement with abduction experiences. Emily describes Robert as listening in a detached but supportive manner when the subject comes up at home. Robert is married and has 3 children, twin girls age 3 and a baby boy of 1.5, as of January 1993, none of whom appears to be involved in the abduction phenomenon. Scott feels grateful for his generally positive family life and cannot connect his abduction experiences to any hidden traumas or other aspects of it. "I look at my family and I look at the way I've grown up, and it doesn't coincide at all," he says. When I first met Scott, he had been coping for several months with trauma related to an abduction experience that occurred in April 1990, in which he reported consciously seeing small beings, the short guys, in his room. He connected the experience with a memory of seeing the same beings in his room and a flying saucer outside when he was 10. Through UFO organizations and a long chain of referrals, Scott finally was referred to a therapist. She was helpful to him, and in their work, which included several hypnosis sessions, he recovered material related to abduction experiences going back to age 3. Scott has regularly attended the support group meetings since November 1991, and he and I have kept in contact outside of the meetings. We did 2 hypnosis, or relaxation sessions in March and December 1992, which Scott sought in order to discover and express his buried emotions more intensely and to explore a more co-investigative, less therapeutic healing model. Details of Scott's early history were obtained from medical records at Children's Hospital Medical Center in Boston from when he was 14 and evaluated for confusional episodes previously labeled as seizures. At 6 months, his mother reported that he had a seizure in association with a fever, and she stated that on his 5th birthday he had a generalized seizure in the absence of a fever but accompanied by ear pain. He was not evaluated by a physician at that time, but his doctor was called and attributed the seizure to the excitement of the day. Scott now sees that time as a post-abduction panic attack. The first abduction experience that Scott has recollected occurred when he was 3. In the summer of 1991, with the help of hypnosis, he and his therapist were exploring events related to the period when he was about 9. When I jumped back to when I was 3 years old playing in the dirt outside, and all of a sudden, boom. I turned around, I was playing with my trucks, and they were there. Out of the corner of his eye, he said he saw 2 beings appearing from nowhere, and then some sort of rod put me under. He remembers running to his mother. After being returned, he was frustrated because he was unable to tell what had happened. "I saw big ants out there," he said. Remembering this experience so alarmed Scott, I jumped clear off the couch, that he discontinued the hypnosis sessions until his first regression with me. Beginning when he was 8, Scott was taken repeatedly to physicians, especially neurologists, for the evaluation and treatment of frequent throbbing headaches that had begun when he was 6, and some sort of spells or seizures that were poorly described as attacks of strange feelings, spacing out, or confusional episodes. He was initially described as a restless 8-year-old boy. The headaches were diagnosed as atypical migraine and treated with mild analgesics, painkillers. An initial electroencephalogram, EEG, during this period was read as mildly abnormal, followed by others that were normal. But over the next several years, Scott was treated with substantial doses of several anticonvulsant medicines that had little effect. An outpatient note from when he was 15 records visual hallucinations from age 12 or 13, in which Scott reported seeing a spinning colored triangle and images such as a woman feminine figure, Scott says, leaning over his bed, cars and outdoor scenes, etc. By the time Scott was 16 or 17, the seizure diagnoses in his record had given way to psycho-emotional components. The headaches had become tension in origin. The hallucinations were described as paroxysmal feelings, and the EEGs were normal. At 18, he was described as somewhat depressed and listless. By 19, the anticonvulsant medications were discontinued, and the medical visits ended. Scott resented what he later came to feel were uninformed and unnecessary medical procedures. "It's just incredible the amount of medical bullshit," he said when I first met with him, and in the support group nearly a year later, he objected to what he called hit-or-miss drugging. Except for night fears, moodiness, difficulty concentrating, and the other symptoms that led his parents to bring him to so many doctors to try to understand what was going on, Scott felt that his childhood was happy and full of friends and activities. Scott's later symptoms bear a complex but not altogether clear relationship to his childhood abduction experiences. Scott thinks they were flashbacks, re-evoked memories of his earlier abductions. Emily has asked repeatedly, "Where was I?" When Scott and Lee were undergoing the abduction experiences, yet compared to most parents of child abductees, both she and Henry have been particularly supportive. "It's bewildering," Emily wrote me in February 1993, a week after her own first hypnosis session with me in which the depth of her commitment to her children was affirmed, that this was all happening right under our eyes, so to speak, and we apparently were not aware of it, consciously at any rate, and to recall Scott's remarks referring to fear of seeing them in his room, flying saucer outside, dog put to sleep, running up to our room, Henry going outside to see what was out there with his gun. We do recall this, but it was at the very back of our memory until this all came up a couple of years ago when Scott said, "Remember when I was a kid?" And we said, "Oh yeah." Later, Emily wrote that she and Henry were fearful of a robber or intruder and also thought that Scott had had a bad dream. Scott recalls that his childhood encounters tended to occur when he was outside with Lee, while Lee remembers a little gully near the house where she and Scott played a lot and which she has come to believe was one of the sites of their abductions. Lee says that we used to love it, but when she was a teenager, she stopped playing there. "I used to think about the place as a special place." When Pam Casey visited the family at their Massachusetts home in March 1992, Scott and his parents talked of various UFO sightings that the extended family had experienced over the years. Scott recalls seeing a ship at age 8 or 9 while riding his bike and reporting it to his uncle. But an abduction experience he describes as a biggie, which had remained buried in his mind until it surfaced in a hypnosis session with his therapist, began in his room when he was 10. Scott reported seeing a flying saucer outside, and then he said he saw several beings come into the room. They put the dog that was in the hall to sleep, somehow with the rod. After they were done with me, Scott became afraid, as I knew they were going upstairs to my parents' room. Scott recalls, I ran upstairs, this was after the event, and I told them what had happened, and I said there was a flying saucer outside, and my father got his gun. He was scared shitless, everybody was, got his gun, and went outside, and there was nothing but nature. Scott recalls, when I was a kid, I was scared to death they were going to kill my parents. The beings seemed to him like a greater power than your parents. Despite his fears, Scott also felt that the beings were somehow more wisdomful than my parents, although he is not sure whether this is them themselves or the wisdom created by the whole experience. Scott describes the telepathy he experiences during the encounters as a two-way channel. They know your thoughts and you can see theirs. It's quite traumatizing because of its unfamiliarity. The next abduction experience that Scott has recalled relates to a feminine figure leaning over his bed when he was 12 or 13, mentioned above in an outpatient note. At about this time, Scott was referred to a psychologist to see if there was an emotional cause of his distress. But even with lengthy psychotherapy, little progress was made toward uncovering its origin. The encounter with the woman figure, which was part of an abduction experience, will be reported in detail in connection with his second hypnosis session with me. Scott does not recall any further discrete abduction experiences until April 1990, when he says he consciously saw several entities in his room after first sensing their presence in his mind. Whoever these people were, they were not from around here, he recalled in his first meeting with me. It was the same people. I knew it, he said, that had been present in his room when he was 10. Alarmed by the experience, he sought help as described above. In several hypnosis sessions with his therapist, Scott recalled that during this abduction, he was terrified as a faucet-like device was placed on his penis, wires or leads applied to his testicles, and a sperm sample taken as he lay terrified and paralyzed on a table in a UFO. After our initial visit and his attendance at several support group meetings, Scott's curiosity about his abduction experiences deepened, and he wished to explore them further because they had affected my life so much. Meanwhile, his personal life was becoming more complicated. When I first met him, Scott told me of strain in his relationship with his girlfriend, a tendency of his to grab on and not be able to let go. In the January 1992 support group, he said that although she had been initially, when it really came down to it, she wasn't very supportive in relation to his abduction experiences. At about this time, Scott was given the opportunity to share his first-hand knowledge of abduction experiences on the set at CBS in Los Angeles, where the two-part docudrama dealing with the phenomenon, Intruders, was being filmed for airing in May. For 2 weeks in February, Scott was on the set each day, which he found highly stimulating. He made a valuable contribution to the cast and crew's understanding of abduction experiences and became close to one of the actresses. At our support group meeting on February 24th, Scott, just back from Los Angeles, spoke of the feeling that we are being prepared for something, that there was perhaps a plan of some sort, that we are not in control and somebody else is running the show. Getting through the trauma part, he said, has opened up the real stuff, the spiritual behind it. And he spoke further of a bigger power at work in his experiences. Scott recalled that even when it happened to me as a kid, he felt he had to work on being able to stay in the same room without panicking, without fear. The April 1990 episode, he said, was a step up in intensity, majorly, and almost like testing. But there's definitely that anger just to lash out from being touched, being under somebody else's control. Scott spoke further in this meeting about breaking through the trauma stuff and of personal growth. His abduction experiences, he said, had made clear to him that There's a massive amount of information in my head that I can't even understand. The aliens, he suggested, are helping us grow so we can comprehend them. They're getting us trained to get us to a point where we can deal with them. Scott elected after this meeting to undergo his first hypnosis session with me in order to move further through and hopefully beyond the traumatic dimensions of his abduction experiences and to discover their deeper meaning for him and for others as well. Scott arrived at my house on March 16th with Anne, the actress he had gotten to know in Los Angeles, before Scott came with Pam and me to the upstairs room where I was then doing the regressions. We chatted a bit in the living room about what the experience of playing such a role had meant for Anne, her objections to the inaccurate and sensationalized parts of the script, and her sensitive efforts to maintain the integrity of the role she was playing. Before beginning the regression, we talked about Scott's apprehensions and his possibly abduction-related experiences since the April 1990 event, which we agreed would be our focus. He had no recollections of discrete abductions, but spoke of vaguer, cloudy kind of stuff, a blue light coming into his room one night, unexplained needle-like marks that had appeared on his arm several times, and how on some mornings his left sock would be mysteriously missing from his foot. Scott spoke of fear of death and aloneness, and of his feeling like something in a cage, an animal, being a specimen. We reviewed the details of the April 1990 experience, and Scott went back briefly over a few of the more frightening details of his previous hypnosis sessions with his therapist. I reassured him that I would not leave him feeling caged and alone during our session. After the hypnotic induction, Scott spoke almost immediately of feeling mad. We then reviewed the events of that April evening before the abduction experience began. He had drunk a couple of screwdrivers, played the piano, and talked generally about his life while in the living room with his mother and father. He was still living with his parents at the time, who were watching television. He went up to bed a little earlier than usual, at 10 o'clock, feeling tenuous and vulnerable about the course of his existence. As he prepared for sleep and jumped in bed, Scott felt some anxiety about a new film shoot that was planned for the next day. Scott recalls reading a magazine, and before he could fall asleep, he felt that the beings were there in my mind. As his fear mounted in our session, Scott spoke of the loss of mental privacy and of the familiarity of these feelings. His room had no door, and unexplained light was coming in from the direction of the adjacent clothes washer-dryer room. Scott's breath was now coming in loud, short gasps as he spoke of 6 of them, with boxy and angular heads that were after me. Then he saw a round-tipped rod pushing toward him, which Scott related to how he was anesthetized. "They know I'm aware," Scott said, "and they put me under so that I couldn't move by touching him with a rod behind his ear." At this point, a buzzing in his right ear changed to a ringing sound, and I lost control of my body. Then all Scott saw was a screen like a TV monitor that was fritzing. Memories of his life flashed before him, as he felt had happened so many times during abductions, and he felt himself struggling to protect his mind so they couldn't touch it. After this, he quite literally lost consciousness, although he had been saying as fast as I could, "I've got to remember, I've got to remember." Next, Scott reported that he was on a table in the presence of 2 doctor-like figures with odd tan and white-tinted skin, wearing glasses and white coats, and several shorter beings in army suits. The beings had deep, black, slightly slanted eyes with grey borders around them. "I hate them for taking me from my mom when I was young," Scott said, "and for not telling me who they are. They're curious about me, and I'm curious, but I hate what they've done." "What did they do?" I asked. "They've used me." The beings then placed a faucet thing, like a suction, over Scott's penis. This device was connected by a tube to a box at the side of the table. At this point, Scott had a kind of out-of-body experience from fear. as he looked down on himself and saw his head on a block-like pillow and 4 prongs being pressed into his neck, high up just below the scalp, which he also felt pushing against him. Scott believed these were like electrodes that were used to manipulate and control his movements and feelings. At this point in our session, and also at the time, he felt calm, although he is angry when he thinks back about what was done to him. I encouraged Scott to center himself through his breathing and to express any feelings that were near the surface. He gave forth a loud growling sound as he spoke of his naked terror, his sense of violation, and his fear of bodily injury. He noticed how quickly he tends to build the walls to protect himself. He saw more light in the room now, and for the first time in the session spoke of the wires that were applied to his testicles. It was these wires, Scott observed, in combination with the suction device over his penis, that stimulated his erection and were making it happen and taking things out, i.e., his sperm. The whole experience, Scott said, just seems unbelievable. The beings communicated telepathically to Scott that they were really taking more white stuff for a purpose. They were using him as a father, taking my babies. All the stuff they took from him was being used, Scott knew, to make babies. Strong feelings of shame came up for Scott at this point, and I explained that he had no reason to be ashamed as he had been confronted by powers or energy forms against which he was altogether powerless. "I'm mad," he said, growling again, "but I can't fight. They know exactly what they're doing." Scott remarked, "That's why they cover it up. They don't want us to remember." I took Scott back one more time to the traumatic, shame-filled aspect of his experience. Once again, he balked at the full reliving of his humiliation. "I don't remember. Too painful," he said. "Too emotional. I had no choice," he allowed. "It's not my fault." But he quickly added, "I should have been able." "Nonsense," I said, and reiterated what I had told him about powers in the world beyond our control. Again, Scott expressed his anger, and I assured him that he couldn't do a damn thing. After this, Scott reported being dropped in bed in his room, feeling very frightened and also angry, but had no recollection of how he was returned. He had the sense the beings had been messing around with my head, leaving information of some sort that he could not access. After coming out of the regression, Scott was struck by the power of the emotions he had experienced. "I've never had those emotions before. Never, never." "It felt good," he said, to give expression through his voice and body to such strong, bottled-up affects. The intensity of his anger bothered Scott some. "I'm scared to death of what damage I can do," he said. "The whole experience," he said, "when it is brought back into the body, it releases these things. We are the emotional patterns that structure things and our reaction." He also was awed by the intensity and brilliance of the light that he had seen while on the table. As a result of the regression, he felt he had more access in this normal reality to the experiences undergone during the abduction. Scott was also left with the feeling, as is common with abductees, that his mind had been electrically manipulated or tampered with. He was aware that there were still walls up everywhere, and that there was much more inside him that he wanted to know about. The 9-month period between our 2 regressions was a time of rapid change for Scott. He brought Anne, who was still in Boston a week after the first regression, to the March 23rd support group meeting. They updated the group on the progress of the mini-series. During the meeting, Scott reflected on an increased preoccupation with philosophical and religious concerns, such as who's in control and the possible views of God. Around that time, Scott also made several television appearances, including an awful show on a Boston channel in which he was humiliatingly, but not untypically, introduced as a young man who had had sex with aliens. As the spring continued, he had increasing difficulty integrating the stimulation and stress related to his high public exposure, and had more frequent meetings with his therapist related to this discomfort. His therapist and I discussed his case, and I referred Scott to a psychiatrist at my hospital for prescription of a mild tranquilizer, which helped to reduce his tension. She described Scott as initially depressed, anxious, very vulnerable, and confused about what had happened to him. He seemed to her to be a traumatized person who had experienced a different kind of trauma, manifesting the hypervigilance and difficulty relaxing you see with other trauma survivors. As far as the abduction story was concerned, I don't know what to make of it, she said. Something bad clearly happened to him. One of the effects of Scott's crisis of helplessness and vulnerability in the summer of 1992 was to rally the support of his family, especially his mother and sister, who began coming to the support group meetings. By September, he was clearly feeling better, spoke in the support group of the need for a sense of humor, and continued to complain about the constant intrusion of the alien presence into his mind, a kind of loss of privacy. Emily told the group movingly of how 2 of my children have been affected, and spoke of how little understanding she had had of the extreme terror to which Scott had been exposed in his abduction experiences. By October, he was speaking more boldly of pushing through his fear and his struggles to integrate his experiences. Scott spoke increasingly through the fall of 1992 of the spiritual dimensions of his abduction experiences. In the November 9th support group meeting, he told of how exposure to them had opened up something in me. It's almost like you're given an intense jump into a spiritual realm you're not even ready for. Like yogis go through tons of work to get to a certain point. Lee, who was about to leave for India, talked of the hardships that people often suffer at the hands of their spiritual teachers. The body's instinctual, fearful reaction to the alien encounters Scott felt was a natural reaction on a species level when confronted with something so deep and unfamiliar. He could not imagine anyone reacting kindly or feeling safe, at least initially. But toward the end of the meeting, Scott asked, "What are my choices?" and told the group, even though the way I think a lot of times is how mad I am, and how upset I am, and how bad my ego's been damaged or wiped out. There's only one way to think about it if I want to live, and that is to look or find whatever there is positive in it, which God is very difficult for me at this time. But that seems like the only thread that will keep me alive. On December 16, 1992, I met with Scott at his request to review his course and, as it turned out, to plan another regression. In that session, he told me that one night about 10 days before, as part of his increasing openness to the alien presence, he asked the beings to show me a sign of their actual existence. At about 2 or 3 in the morning, he experienced in a partially awake state the feeling of somebody touching me from behind. He became extremely frightened, but the touching continued. It was almost like teasing me. The concreteness of the response to his request alarmed Scott. I asked for them to show me something, and they did. In a way, he said. Many abductees begin to pursue a more explicit spiritual path as they open themselves to the depth and meaning of their experiences. Scott himself, in addition to his increasing curiosity about the spiritual dimensions of the phenomenon, had begun to meet with an acupuncturist, and more recently with a shamanic healer. He was also increasingly challenging the traditional treatment model. Scott said of some of the therapists he had seen, "I feel I could heal, I could help them more than they could help me. And that sounds completely arrogant, I know." His request to undertake another regression was part of Scott's desire to move beyond the traumata of his abduction experiences to a more reciprocal, mutually communicative relationship with the alien beings. We scheduled the session for 5 days later. At the beginning of the session, we reviewed how frightened, needy, and vulnerable, yet also more alive, Scott had felt during the summer. Although he had had a recent abduction experience, we decided to do an open-ended regression. In recent months, I had found that the psyche's own wisdom would take the experiencer where he or she needs to go in the altered state of consciousness, and that the healing, integrating, and information-gathering process is better served by not targeting a specific abduction experience. Before the regression, Scott spoke of his fear of letting go and his determination not to hold back in this session. At the start of the regression, after several 30 to 60-second pauses, Scott spoke of feeling the presence of one of them standing by a table on which he was lying on his back. He was 13 and said that he had never faced or even recalled what happened to him at that age. He perceived a cylindrical tube he estimated to be 4 inches in diameter that was part of a machine near a wall. The image of the tubing, which seemed to be pointing at his chest, was disturbing and faded in and out of his consciousness. He also had images of other tools, like a curved banana-shaped instrument, on another nearby table. Soon he reported seeing a non-human female figure carrying a tray with several cylinders, each containing a little baby in glasses. "I'm really mad," Scott said, "but I don't know what they're doing." The woman, who had come quite near him, recalled the hallucination he had at 12 or 13 years old of a female figure leaning over his bed, left the room, and Scott realized that the aliens, probably this figure herself, had been taking his seeds for the purpose of making the babies he had just been shown. Scott realizes now that his fear prevented him from looking directly at the beings, though he had attributed this to their elusiveness. He also speculated that if he had remembered seeing the beings during this or these experience, he might have told his parents, which the aliens told him not to do. For he was part of their family, one of the beings explained. "If I'm part of their family, why am I here?" Scott asked. I encouraged him to explore that question. He kept getting images of an empty cylinder about 6 inches in diameter and about a foot long, with clear fluid inside. "I want to be one of them, and I want to be one of me," Scott said, "but I can't be both." "Why not?" I asked. "Then I'm never home either way." Next, Scott reported being taken down into a huge underground, rock-walled place by one of a bunch of fast-moving elevators. It was hot there, but better than family here, for they know everything about me. There are no secrets. Nevertheless, it's scary and just feels weird. At this point, I felt that Scott was judging the truth of what was happening with his analytical mind, and I encouraged him just to report his raw experience, saving the judgments for later. "I just can't believe they're here," Scott said. "When they come for me, they know everything I know." He said it made him feel bad that they would not let him talk about these experiences. He wondered, why don't they stay? He received no answer to this question, except that they and we aren't ready. He said the beings are in the process of changing themselves physically so they can breathe here. They don't breathe the same as we do. Scott revealed other problems for both of our species should the aliens' presence be manifest on a large scale too soon. "We're not up to their speed," he said. "They think much faster than we do, and they're going to make it so they don't hurt us." "How would their thinking faster hurt us?" I asked. "It is confusing when they talk to us with their minds," he replied. "Too much information. Our minds are not used to such contact. It's a sensory overload." At this point, the session took an interesting turn. Scott acknowledged that he himself had persisted in denying the existence of the aliens, and I asked him to explore what it was exactly that he was denying. To my surprise, he replied, "Denying that I am one of them." To acknowledge the being's existence, he said, has meant that he would have to experience a kind of empty feeling, a nostalgia for another domain. "I've always known," he said, "that I was different, that I wasn't from around here." When he was a child, Scott recalled, "I always wanted to run away. I couldn't figure it out. I could run anywhere, but I couldn't get there." He said he knew that the beings did not reside in our solar system. Scott grasped then why he had never wanted to look directly at the beings. With some struggle, he said, "My humanness doesn't want to see this." "What is this?" I asked. "Them. The human side," he continued, "cannot handle the other side. The human being in him reacts with fear, like an animal. They appear to be animals, and you act like a scared animal. It's instinct." Nevertheless, he emphasized, humans must stop and realize that the aliens, whom as a child he called the Inkies because of their large black eyes, like ourselves, are alive. We need to learn that even though we look different and we think different, we're all life. Scott's narrative moved then into the apocalyptic vision I have heard increasingly from abductees. "Major changes in the world are coming," he said. "The aliens will only come when it's safer. But that will not occur until there are less and less of us as we die off from disease, especially more communicable forms of AIDS that will reach plague proportions." This material was frightening and very sad for Scott, and he also felt that he was not allowed to speak of it. Although he was positive in his conviction about this, he said, "I just hope I was wrong." At this point in the session, Scott shifted to perceiving from the alien perspective, and he saw the Earth as a blue body below him. He had chosen to come here from another planet, he said, because it was closest to where we're from. He did not know the name of that planet, but it was yellow, mostly desert, and lacking water. Once there had been trees and water, but something having to do with science, he does not know just what, went wrong, and his people went underground. Scott felt sick inside and sobbed as he told of how science destroyed our planet. I asked Scott if he had any further information about how this had come about. But he did not, except to observe that somehow the alien species knew before the destruction occurred, but seems to have been powerless to prevent it. After the regression, he recalled that the destruction had occurred because of something they made they couldn't stop, and that on their planet, the aliens live in an artificial environment. With considerable resistance, Scott admitted that the intention of the aliens was to live here, on Earth, but without us, unless humans change, in which case we might be able to live together. Then he contrasted the ways of humans with the aliens. Human beings are alone, and they don't share. In the alien realm, nobody's in their own world, and everybody knows everything. There are no secrets. I asked him about himself. "I'm one of them," he said, "but in his human identity he imposes limits on his ability to love and share because of my own ignorance." I asked, "What else?" "Tradition. The whole focus of my life, my independence," he said. "Because of fear of being hurt, of not getting what you want, fear of not receiving, human beings have trouble opening up and trusting that it's okay to give and feel love. Change has got to start somewhere," Scott said, and I asked him about his leadership role, to which he had referred earlier, as a kind of intermediary between the two species. "There's going to be so much work," he said, "and it is going to take a long time." I asked if he thought there was time. "Yes, I think so," he replied. He was getting tired, so I asked if there was anything else he wanted to say before sitting up. He said, "It's got to be done one way or the other." "What's got to be done?" I asked. "If we don't change, it's going to change for us." Then he added rather sadly, "I don't think we can live with them." After the regression, Scott felt awkward about what he had revealed. He had difficulty trusting the information he had received because there's nothing that reinforces it when you're growing up. "One realm has nothing to do with the other," he said, "and we are rarely, if ever, exposed to the existence of the alien side. Fear simply does not exist in the consciousness of that side, and so there is greater freedom there. Yet it is difficult for Scott and makes him sad and afraid to acknowledge anything about the alien world, especially that he is part of it, for that means that I'm not one of us humans." I spoke then with Scott about the possibility of integrating his alien and human identities, and he recalled how that just didn't work when I was a kid. That's just not the way people live, he said. People are just different. I told him of 4 or 5 other double agents I was working with and of the possibility of their getting together as a group, which he thought would be a good idea. After this session, Scott felt great relief, as if a huge weight had been removed. He recalled that since early childhood, he experienced himself as having 2 personalities, and spoke of how crazy that had always made him feel. He now believes that the doubting and denying of his alien experience has been a destructive process in his life, and wonders what part telepathy plays in the perception of the dual identity. Before concluding, Scott, Pam, and I talked further of the meaning of the perceived alien-human project. "I don't think they're disposing of us. I think they're taking part of us," Scott said. "Then they'll have everything we'll have, and they'll have everything they have. But there are problems with the integrating of our species, for you and I, as we are, maybe won't mix." We speculated then about the relationship of the aliens' apparent presence on our planet and the accelerating, catastrophic destruction of the Earth's living environment. "It's not just coincidence," Scott said. From the information he has received, Scott doubts that we would survive our catastrophe as well as the aliens did theirs. For them, it was not the beginning of science. I mean, they were well into science before this happened. Whatever happened. It was a lot further ahead than we were. They had the resources to survive. I pressed Scott to say more of what he knew of the relationship between our 2 species. "It isn't just black and white," he said, "the 2 sides. There's a correspondence between the 2. My last question had to do with his reluctance to look into the eyes of the aliens. He replied that when he was experiencing the alien perspective, he felt he was viewing reality through their eyes. But as a human, I was scared too because I'd be looking at myself. "Yourself as what?" I asked. "As one of them," he replied. I asked him to say what was so frightening about that, but he did not know. He simply added, "My whole life has been useless. I mean, everything I've done has been insignificant." "Compared to what?" I asked. "If I had realized that his complex double identity a long time ago," he replied. The day after the regression, Scott told me that he felt at peace, and that all my questions just disappeared very quickly. That's amazing. He told the support group on February 8th that he felt quite self-sufficient now. On December 23rd, he wrote me a letter which accompanied a Christmas card. After writing emphatically about the immense weight he suspected went along with "what you referring to me know," he shared further information that had come to him since the regression. Success on Earth would take an incredible shift, he wrote, a shift from ego gratification to aspiring to achieve, but aspiring to rid ourselves of the human flaw. The difficulty, he continued, is to eradicate the human flaws without destroying the machine itself. They are glued together very tight. The growing pains are extreme but necessary. Communicating with his alien voice, he then wrote, "Our intellectual abilities and the scope of our view is too much for humans to understand. The translators, as I am, are necessary in order to make contact. I've always known. I've always denied his alien identity. I always wanted to forget, but that's not who I am. The reality comes through the thick screen of human defenses. The study continues of the human-alien consciousness struggle. They are integrating, each learning from the other. I am at peace now. I understand, I realize the conflict will continue inside me, but I have reached the turning point where my power of uncontrol has overcome that of my human side. I fear humans more than anything else," the letter went on. "We have tried to change you many times. Many members of our species have been destroyed in the process. I must say the human being has very heightened emotions. too much for me to process at times. We are very sensitive, but our emotions are not as primitive as your own. Your emotions are recreation in a sense. We are happy to be able to feel more than we normally feel. Our fascination with humans revolves on this. Our evolutionary process has deemed emotions less important than understanding, but it's like candy to a child, your emotions to us. It is like a drug that we enjoy very much. It is interesting, the letter concluded, that this is the very thing which also makes you so dangerous to us. I do not feel it is safe for me to come out yet. It will be a few years. I feel there is much I wish to convey, and I feel at a time very soon there should be a meeting of the high powers of your world with us. Although he had a few anxious nights following the regression, in the next few months, Scott made rapid strides toward achieving greater peace of mind, a heightened sense of energy and purpose, integration of his human alien identity, and deepening understanding of the meaning for him of his abduction experiences. He was confident about the information he had received and conveyed in our regressions, and felt that for the first time he could face its implications honestly and realistically. Discussion Scott's case illustrates the multiple levels on which we can think about the abduction phenomenon. At one level, he is, or has been, a typically traumatized abductee. He has experienced the terror, helplessness, paralysis, and instrumentation, especially the humiliating forced extraction of sperm for making babies, which he later reported seeing during a regression, that have followed upon several recalled childhood abduction experiences in association, on at least one occasion, with a close-up UFO sighting. But in addition to this nuts and bolts, or clearly physical dimension, Scott has also undergone an important personal transformation that has been the result of a shift in his attitude toward his experiences. Of inestimable importance in this process has been the support of Scott's parents, especially his mother, Emily, herself a possible experiencer, who has attended conferences on the subject of abductions, come regularly to my monthly support group, and volunteered to undergo hypnosis with me in order to understand more deeply her own experiences and the ways that she can more fully support Scott and his sister, Lee, who is also an abductee. Through his constant attitude of inquiry, his search for spiritual meaning, and, above all, his willingness to confront and move through his terror repeatedly, Scott has been able to achieve considerable peace of mind and a deeper sense of understanding of the abduction experience process. By overcoming his denial and accepting the instinctual, natural basis of his bodily terror and resentment, Scott has been able to open his psyche to important information concerning a widening sense of his own identity and to take responsibility for his apparent role as a translator between our two worlds. A crucial period for him in this process was the summer months of 1992, when he was 24. He was then able to acknowledge deep within himself his vulnerability, helplessness in the face of the power of the alien energies, and the stark fact of his lack of control. He discovered then, as he later wrote in his Christmas letter to me, his power of uncontrol. Scott feels that his psychic powers have increased as a result of his experiences. As has occurred in the case of several abductees with whom I have been working recently, Scott's full acknowledgement of the reality of the alien presence has led him to the realization that he always had a kind of dual identity and is capable of experiencing himself as both human and alien. The alien perspective, which apparently has always been embedded in his consciousness, was not available to him until he surrendered the illusion of control. From this point of view, Scott